Well, Dr. Hellyer,
Hello, Michael.
it hasn't been long since Cost of Defence Part 1, after the government released the Defence Strategic Update and the accompanying Force Structure Plan. But now we have the departmental budget out of the Treasurer's October budget, and there is some more to say. So first, do you want to give me the headline number, and then we can start to talk about some of the issues that pop out of this budget documentation, because you're now releasing the Cost of Defence Part 2.
That's right. So we've done two parts of the Cost of Defence this year. First part came out in August, looking at the government's Defence Strategic Update that mapped out the course of defence for the next 10 years. And we've just released Part 2, which focuses in on this year's budget, the 2021 budget, which sort of provides a little more detail around this year and the 3 years after that. And I guess the big picture is that the budget itself does deliver the funding that the government promised in the strategic update. And it's a pretty generous funding line. So there's been a big increase this year, about $3.5 billion more, which brings the defence budget up to about $42.7 billion. I know everybody's really interested in the percentage of GDP issue. 2021 was the year that the government promised to hit 2%. And the budget actually does that quite easily. It actually has surged to 22.19%. That's partly due to coronavirus impacting GDP growth, but probably that number, the 42.7, would have hit 2% anyway. So we've actually surged past 2%, and the trajectory over the next few years continues that. And in about the next 3 or 4 years, it could even hit about 2.4%.
Well, I think your projection of 2.4% of GDP is against a pretty rosy economic recovery that sees a resumption of 2.5% per annum growth in GDP by the Australian economy fairly quickly.
That's right. We've just defaulted to using the government's budget papers predictions for GDP for the next few years, and they are pretty optimistic. You know, whether that's right or wrong is not for me to say, but we've plugged those numbers in. Now, you could say that it is a longer-term risk for defence if economic recovery stalls, and that gap between the actual funding line and a hypothetical 2% line gets bigger and bigger, potentially could hit $9 or $10 billion a year. That becomes quite an attractive target for governments who are looking to find money for other priorities.
Yes, but I suppose the flip side of that is the government said our strategic environment requires this kind of investment. To me, though, the risk is one around delivery. And I think there's some interesting stuff in your analysis about the kind of delivery challenge, even in, say, the capital program for this next financial year and the next few financial years. So the lift required in that spend.
Yeah, that's right. So even all the way back to the 2016 white paper, it was pretty clear that the big winner inside the defence budget was the capital acquisition budget. The strategic update confirmed that, and again, it's been confirmed once again in the 2021 budget. So I mentioned there's a $3.5 billion increase this year. $3 billion of that goes into the defence capital budget. So what that essentially means is this year, defence has to spend 27% more than it did last year buying stuff. And you sort of go, if you look back over the last 4 or 5 years, defence has averaged about 5% growth a year. This year, it's got to hit 27% growth. I mean, that's
so got to hit 5 times that amount of annual growth.
It's a huge ask, particularly when you look at global supply chains being impacted by COVID-19. It's going to be hard, I think, to ramp that up. Now, I know, the government would love to spend a lot of that, delivering an economic stimulus to regional Australia, but I don't think they're going to get that money out the door. So there's always, that use it or lose it risk. And I guess the bigger issue is that growth trajectory continues over the next 10 years. So defence is going to have to find a way very quickly to learn how to spend a lot more money. And Australian industry is going to have to absorb that money as well, because the government is pretty clear that it wants Defence's acquisition budget to flow increasingly into local industry.
If you're going to spend about 60% of that capital investment domestically, that's a big lift in the amount of Australian industry spend, because there aren't the big foreign military sales spends coming through. I think you make the point that JSF is going to keep spending about $2 billion per annum for the next few years, but that's really the last of the big FMS cases. So a lot of the rest of this is going to have to go on things that have a greater proportion of Australian spend, and that's a really big challenge for defence.
And again, that's going to be hard because yes, there are big programs coming down the line, the Future Submarine and Future Frigate programs, but you can't really accelerate them. You can't accelerate the build until you finish designing them. And we're still a couple of years away from the start of construction for the frigates and 3 to 4 years for the submarine. So it's hard to spend a lot more money there quickly. So that's going to be very challenging, I think.
Yeah. Another bit of your report that you focused on was the sustainment side of the business. And there, I think there are some really big changes going on. You know, you mentioned that for the last few years, the Collins submarine has been the single biggest spender of sustainment money, about $690 million a year. But it's soon going to be overtaken by 4 other big programs. And I think they are interesting to people. So in the future years, what are the top 4 sustainment spenders?
Well, so if we look down the track, sustainment costs are growing up, and there's a number of drivers for that. One is the size of platforms, but the other is complexity of platforms, and on top of that, got numbers of platforms. And we can see all of those things at work in Defence's big projects. So some of these changes are a long way down the track. So if we look at submarines, going from Collins to the Future Submarine, probably the Future Submarine, I think, will cost at least 3 times as much to operate as the Collins fleet in current day dollars.
And there'll be a time when both fleets are being operated. So submarine sustainment is going to be a large call on the budget.
But that's the sort of cost further down the track because we know we're not getting the first Future Submarine until 2034. Some of those costs are starting to impact now, though. So JSF, we've always known JSF was going to cost a lot to operate. The first few years of data that we're seeing from Australian service are pretty high. So Defence was predicted about $34,000 a flying hour for JSF. So far it's about $50,000. And that's about 3 times, 4 times as much as the classic Hornet that it's replacing. So that big sustainment cost increase is here already. The next one we're going to encounter will be armoured vehicles. So in the grand scheme of things, Defence's current armoured vehicles don't cost very much to operate at all. They never figure in the top 30 list. That's going to change with Boxer and with the Future Infantry Fighting Vehicle. And in fact, those programs together could actually be more than Collins, which has traditionally been the biggest spender. So
you're forecasting about $700 million per annum to sustain the Army's armoured vehicles, which, just to give an idea of proportion, that's about 10 times what it currently costs to sustain the Army's current armoured vehicles, isn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, it's some pretty, big hands kind of modelling, but it's using some of the data that Defence has commissioned and that's been released, so it's a complete figment of my imagination. So these are just illustrations of rising sustainment costs that some are starting to hit now and some are going to get very big down the track.
But I think if you look at the value for money side of things, the acquisition cost combined with that very large year-on-year cost for sustaining these complex armoured vehicles, and then you look at the vulnerability of armoured vehicles to drone strikes, for example, even in a conflict with Armenia and Azerbaijan, you start thinking, is this value for money? Do you think that's something that could do with some more assessment?
I think it's really time for the government to kind of put a pause on the Future Armoured Vehicle project. One of the big bits of sort of news in the strategic update is that Defence's estimate for the cost of acquiring the infantry fighting vehicles blew out by 80%. So it went from $10 to $15 billion to $18 to $27 billion. If we pick the midpoint of that $18 to $27 billion and take the number of vehicles that Defence wants, which is 450, it actually works out to about $50 million a vehicle. You know, that's a pretty huge amount of money. And as you say, you know, you turn on the TV and, you know, everywhere you see footage of armoured vehicles being destroyed by precision-guided weapons, from whether it's from drones, from aircraft, launched out of artillery, fired by infantrymen. There's a lot of threats out there.
And it's not $50 million of offensive firepower that's killing these vehicles. That's the problem.
It's a $100,000 weapon.
Yeah.
You know, so the whole value for money calculus, I think, has swung to the offence at the moment. And I think, you know, we may need to reconsider that. Aside from the issue of, you know, exactly where are we going to use them, how are we going to get them there, you know, I think I haven't seen a compelling business case for that investment.
Now, there's two other things that are just worth drawing out that are in your report. One is the ICT program, you know, information communications and telecommunication. The broken backbone of defence that past defence secretaries have spoken about has often related to defence's slow change in its information systems, and there's not much transparency around that spend, is there? Remind me how big that spend is, maybe comparing it to another Commonwealth agency.
Well, so if you take Defence's ICT spend next year, if we combine its acquisition spend, so buying new systems, and its sustainment spend, so operating its current systems and providing services across Defence, it's about $1.8 billion. That's actually bigger than the entire budget of some agencies like the AFP. Well, the AFP gets some pretty close scrutiny from government, but Defence's ICT spend gets no scrutiny whatsoever. There's no reporting against it except for a paragraph in the annual report, which generally tends to say it's not going that great. And so it's really hard to see how well it's going and whether we're getting value for money for that.
And there's some real lumpiness in some of the spend, which makes you wonder about the underlying issues. Like I remember just a few years ago, there was a collapse in the capital investment spend on Defence ICT, but it was offset by an increase in sustaining all the legacy platforms that Defence already had. And that could be a very interesting story in itself, couldn't it?
Well, I guess all I can say is it's very hard to know what's going on there because the reporting is so minimal, and so there is big shifts in spending and where the money goes. The bottom line is it's hard to know, are we getting value for money there? So at least with a lot of the equipment projects, the bigger ones, you can see what the total approved budget is, how Defence is tracking against spending that money, is it on schedule, you know, are we actually getting anything in return for it? In the ICT program, despite there being $1.8 billion, we see nothing whatsoever. And as you say, it is the backbone of Defence. If the ICT doesn't work, all of the billion-dollar investment in sophisticated platforms is pretty much nugatory because you can't stitch all of that together into a kind of integrated whole. So I think, you know, the government and Parliament really kind of need better information to be able to sort of track how Defence is going in its ICT programs.
Well, I think it's another enduring theme that we at ASPI have had, and you certainly have with your assessment around cost of defence. It's that improved transparency tends to drive improved performance. Now, we're pretty much out of time. I think we'll do something separate around some of the big shipbuilding programs in a frigate and submarine, because I think there's some interesting things to say there, and you've covered some of it in the publication itself. But the last thing I thought we could talk about now is that interesting fifth arm of defence. So, you know, there's a lot of focus on how big is the Army, how big is the Navy, how big is the Air Force, what's happening to all those public servants, you know, are we sacking them for efficiency reasons, or are we realising that it's an integrated organisation and employing a few more to deliver this really complex, big program of work to spend $575 billion? But the fifth arm of the defence workforce is really its external workforce. And you've done quite a bit of analysis around that in this part two, cost of defence.
Yeah, so it's interesting, you know, the government now describes industry as one of the fix, so one of the fundamental inputs into capability for defence, and it's becoming clear how fundamental that is. So over the last decade, the number of civilians in defence has fallen, particularly in Capability Acquisition and Sustainment Group, which is responsible for acquiring and sustaining capability. They're the ones spending the money, and they have those huge capital and sustainment programs. But they've had less people to do it. Not surprisingly, they've had to essentially turn to the private sector to deliver the people and the skills that allows defence to run those huge programs.
So what kind of numbers are in that external workforce for defence?
Well, interestingly, earlier this year, under a Freedom of Information request, Defence put out the results of its what it calls its external workforce census, and it counted up 28,000 external service providers of various kinds, whether consultants, contractors or service providers. So that ranges from your fancy consultant on $2,000 a day to the people preparing meals in messes on bases, to the people pulling engine aircraft together to keep aircraft flying. But it's about 28,000 people, which would actually make it Defence's second biggest service after the Army. So it's a pretty large number doing a whole range of tasks. But the ones I've really focused on in the cost of defence are the people who are actually doing sort of management, project management type roles. So the kinds of things that used to primarily be done in defence, but it doesn't really have the people to do anymore. So it either needs to buy in individuals to help out, or it essentially outsources the entire management of a project. And so you have industry people managing other industry people to deliver projects. And I sort of added up about $2 billion worth of contracts in that kind of space. So it's not just buying weapons that's big business, it's actually providing the project management skills to buy those weapons. It's also big
people
business.
And skills. And you think with that real lift in the capital program and the need to do more of that complex capital investment with Australian industry, that's going to require more of that external workforce to manage and deliver that. So the challenge for local industry is also in that above the line help to defence to manage the rest of industry.
I think it's inevitable because defence is not going to have the internal workforce to do it. You look at the huge ramp up in the trajectory of both the capital and the sustainment budgets. The only way that's going to get delivered, I think, is by defence using even more external service providers. So that $2 billion number is also going to go up.
Well, Marcus, we're out of time. Be happy to talk about some of the other details in other episodes of the podcast and things around launching the publication. But to me, the big insight coming out of your analysis is if anyone is complacent about the challenge that defence has in delivering on the government's funding and the ambition in the strategic update, then they should stop being complacent right now and start focusing on delivery.
Oh yeah, the risks around delivery are huge, and it's not a problem in 10 years' time, it's a problem that is around right now.
Thanks, Marcus.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay.